He poured me a drink with the same hands that ordered my father's execution. He called me beautiful. He called me destiny. He never knew I was the daughter of the man he destroyed. And while he planned our future, I was mapping out his funeral. He poured me a drink with the same hands that signed my father's death warrant. The glass touched mine gently. His eyes held mine a second too long, calm, confident, untouchable. He didn't know who I was, and I didn't come to forgive. Years ago, my father was a king in his own territory, not a criminal, not a politician, a builder, a man who controlled ports along the West African coast, shipping lanes that fed half the region, containers, oil equipment, agricultural exports. He believed trade was power. He believed dignity was non-negotiable. Then the Koreans came, not tourists, not partners, predators dressed as investors, a conglomerate expanding aggressively into African infrastructure, clean suits, polite bows, promises of modernization. Behind them stood one name, the heir. He was younger then, educated in Seoul and London, known for precision, ruthless efficiency, the kind of man who treated markets like chessboards and people like expendable pieces. They offered my father a deal, transfer majority control of his ports in exchange for capital and strategic partnership. It sounded generous. It was a takeover. My father refused. He told them something I will never forget. We collaborate. We do not surrender. In our culture, refusal is not disrespect. It is strength. You protect your land, your name, your ancestors. But in his world, refusal is humiliation. The pressure started immediately. Regulatory audits, frozen accounts, political allies turning silent, anonymous threats disguised as advice, contracts revoked overnight. I remember the night my father realized this was no longer business. He stood in our living room, phone pressed to his ear, speaking English instead of our language. His voice was controlled, but I could see the tightness in his jaw. "Yes," he said. "Tell your boss I understand what he's implying." Pause. "No, I will not reconsider." That was the first time I heard the heir's name spoken in our house. I was not supposed to be listening. 2 weeks later, my father's car exploded on a highway outside the city. The news called it instability, sabotage, regional violence. But violence has signatures, and this one was corporate. At the funeral, women wrapped in black geal moved like shadows. The air was heavy with incense and dust. Drums beat low, steady, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. People cried. I didn't. I stood beside the casket and made a decision that would shape every breath I took afterward. I would not scream. I would not beg. I would learn. Because men like him do not fall to rage. They fall to strategy. For years, I disappeared. I studied international finance, corporate law, Korean language, and etiquette. I learned how chaebols operate. Family dynasties disguised as public companies. I studied power structures, board politics, shadow subsidiaries. I learned how reputation can be more fragile than glass. And when I was ready, I went to Seoul. The city was colder than I expected. Sharp lines, neon lights, controlled smiles. His empire was everywhere. Luxury hotels, logistics companies, technology firms. Clean, impeccable, untouchable. I didn't approach him directly. I entered through the front door. I secured a position inside his hospitality division. International partnerships. My resume was flawless. Education abroad, experience in African trade networks, multilingual, useful. That's what I needed to be. Our first meeting was not dramatic, it was efficient. He walked into the conference room with 2 directors behind him. Dark suit, minimal expression. Eyes that assessed everything in seconds. Sam, when his gaze landed on me, it paused. Not because I was African, because I did not look away. In Korea, hierarchy breathes in every room. Deference is instinct, subtle bows, lowered tones, controlled posture. I respected the form, but I did not shrink. When I introduced myself, my Korean was precise, controlled, polished. He raised an eyebrow. Your background is unusual, he said. So is your expansion strategy, I replied. A risk. Silence filled the room. Then, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Interest. That was the beginning. He began requesting my presence in meetings involving African logistics. My insight, he called it. I corrected his projections, adjusted his cultural assumptions, explained why certain negotiations required elders present, why time in West Africa moves differently than quarterly reports. He listened. That surprised me. Men like him are trained to dominate conversations. But he observed. On our third private strategy session, he poured me soju himself, a subtle signal. In his world, that gesture carries weight. I value loyalty, he said quietly. So do I answered. The irony almost made me laugh. He spoke about expansion as if it were destiny. Korea's rise, global influence, efficiency conquering chaos. I thought of my father's voice. We collaborate. We do not surrender. Weeks turned into months. He began inviting me to exclusive events, art galas, investor dinners, private lounges overlooking the Han River. Cameras flashed, executives bowed, whispers followed us. I could feel it happening. He was becoming attached, and attachment is vulnerability. But something dangerous started to grow inside me. No, he was not reckless, not cruel in small ways. He funded scholarships in emerging markets, sponsored African-Korean cultural exchanges, spoke about long-term stability instead of a quick extraction. That confused me. I expected arrogance. Instead, I found discipline. And that made him more dangerous. One night after a board dinner, we stood alone on a balcony high above the city, wind cutting through the silence. Do you believe in revenge? He asked suddenly. The question hit harder than it should have. I believe in balance, I said. He studied me carefully. My father taught me that weakness invites destruction, he continued. If you hesitate, someone else takes what is yours. And if you take everything, I asked softly, what remains? He didn't answer. For a moment, he looked tired, human. That was the first crack in my armor. Because revenge is easy when your enemy is a monster. It becomes complicated when he is a man. Then I found the file. An archived authorization document buried inside a secured internal server. Dated the week before my father's death. Approval for coercive stabilization measures regarding West African port negotiations. Digitally signed. By him. Not his father. Not an executive committee. Him. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. Something colder settled inside me. He didn't inherit the crime. He executed it. The next morning, he asked me to join him on a trip to Busan to finalize a major shipping contract. I smiled. Of course. On the train, he watched the coastline through the window. You're different, he said quietly. From what? From anyone I've met. He meant it as affection. I heard it as opportunity. Because he was right. I was different. I was the daughter of the man he erased. And while he imagined a future with me, partnership, expansion, maybe even love, I was calculating timelines, investor confidence metrics, media pressure points, board loyalties. He reached for my hand. I let him. Because complete ruin requires trust. And he was already falling. He just didn't know I was the one loosening the ground beneath his feet. The first move was quiet. A logistics contract tied to West African shipping routes, one he considered guaranteed. I redirected key negotiations through an intermediary firm, secretly aligned with his biggest domestic rival. I didn't falsify numbers. I didn't fabricate documents. I simply adjusted timing with influence and access. In corporate warfare, delay is a weapon. When the deal collapsed publicly, he didn't panic. He recalculated. That's what made him formidable. But I was inside his recalculations. I anticipated his corrections before he made them. I fed small truths to investigative journalists, nothing dramatic, just enough to trigger curiosity. Offshore subsidiaries, unusual fund transfers, layered shell structures that looked legal until examined closely. Regulators began circling. Still, he didn't suspect me. Instead, he pulled me closer. "Someone is testing us," he said one night in his office, Seoul glowing beneath us. "Then we adapt," I replied calmly. He searched my face for fear. He found none, because fear had left me years ago on a highway filled with smoke. He invited me to his family estate during Chuseok, a traditional hanbok, formal bows to ancestral tablets, ritual wine poured with careful precision. His world was built on hierarchy and lineage. Respect flowed upward, authority flowed downward. I performed every gesture perfectly. His mother watched me carefully. An outsider. African, but composed. Educated. Controlled. At dinner, he announced his intention without saying the word. "She understands our future," he said. Marriage. An alliance that would stabilize his expansion into African markets permanently. His board would approve instantly. His father would have approved even faster. He believed he was securing power. He was accelerating his collapse. Because while he imagined union, I was finalizing exposure. The second strike came through the board. I anonymously delivered evidence of internal corruption. 2 senior executives siphoning funds through inflated procurement contracts. They were loyal to him. Old guard. When the Internal Audit Committee launched an emergency review, fractures appeared. Loyalty shifts quickly when survival is threatened. He confronted the board with authority, controlled anger, strategic concessions. But doubt had entered the room. And doubt spreads faster than scandal. Then, the media storm hit. A financial outlet published an expose on irregular capital flows tied to African operations. They didn't accuse him directly. They questioned oversight. Markets react to uncertainty, not proof. Stock prices dipped. Investors demanded clarity. Prosecutors announced preliminary inquiries. He stood before cameras, composed as ever. "I welcome transparency," he said. And I almost admired him. Almost. Because the truth was simpler. Transparency destroys empires built on shadows. That night he came to me, not as a CEO, as a man. "Someone close to me is responsible," he said quietly. His voice held something new, doubt. "Do you trust me?" he asked. I held his gaze. Yes. The lie didn't tremble. He reached for me, like I was the only stable ground left. And for 1 second, one dangerous second, I felt the weight of what I was doing, because this was no longer abstract revenge. This was a man unraveling. Then I remembered my father's coffin. The third strike was decisive. I released the archived authorization, his digital signature approving coercive measures against my father's ports. I didn't attach my name. I routed it through secure international channels. Within 48 hours, it was in the hands of prosecutors. This time, the headline carried his name. Not implied, direct. Raids followed. Offices searched. Devices confiscated. Senior managers detained for questioning. He didn't call me immediately. He disappeared into legal war rooms and emergency strategy sessions. 3 days later, he summoned me to his private residence. No security, no staff, just him. He looked different. Not broken, but stripped. "Who are you?" he asked. No anger, no shouting, just clarity. This was the moment I had built for years. I gave him my real name. I watched recognition bloom slowly across his face, memory aligning with guilt. "The port," he said quietly. "Yes." Silence settled between us like smoke. My father died in a car explosion 2 weeks after refusing your acquisition." He didn't deny it. He didn't deflect. "It was a stabilization operation," he said, calm, precise. "Your father would have blocked our expansion permanently. In my world, hesitation invites destruction. In mine," I replied, "honor means something." He exhaled slowly. "You infiltrated my company for revenge." "Yes. And you let me," he stopped, "fall in love." The words hung unspoken. "If you wanted to destroy me," he continued, "you could have exposed this years ago. Why now?" "Because ruin without trust is incomplete." That was the truth. He absorbed it without flinching. Then, he asked the question I wasn't prepared for. Did any of it feel real? I should have answered immediately. I didn't, and that hesitation was louder than confession. Days later, the board convened an emergency session. Pressure from investors mounted. Prosecutors intensified investigations. International partners distanced themselves. He faced potential indictment. Prison was no longer theoretical. But before the final hearing, I discovered something I had never anticipated. A quiet fund, diverted years ago from corporate profits into infrastructure projects in my father's region. Schools rebuilt, port equipment modernized, local businesses financed discreetly. No press releases, no public credit. I traced the authorization. It led to him, not as restitution, as respect. He had studied my father, admired his refusal, called him the only negotiator who did not fear us. This was not mercy, it was acknowledgement, and it destabilized me more than any board vote. Because revenge is clean when your enemy is purely evil. It becomes complicated when he carries contradiction. The final evidence remained in my possession, a document that would guarantee his personal indictment beyond corporate liability. If I released it, prison was certain. If I withheld it, he would fall, but survive. He requested one final meeting before his formal resignation. He no longer wore tailored perfection, just a dark coat, no tie. "I will step down," he said, voluntarily. "To protect the company?" I asked. "To accept responsibility." He looked at me steadily. "You won." There was no accusation in his voice, only fact. For years, I imagined this moment would feel victorious. Instead, it felt heavy, because I had dismantled his empire the same way he dismantled my father's. Strategically, unemotionally, efficiently. I became fluent in his language, power, leverage, consequence. He resigned publicly the next morning, before formal indictment. The company announced restructuring, new leadership, commitment to transparency. He disappeared from public life. No farewell interview, no dramatic arrest, just absence. I stood at my father's grave weeks later. The drums echoed in my memory again. Slow, steady. I told him it was done. But as I walked away, a question followed me. Did I restore balance? Or did I become the reflection of the man I destroyed? Months later, a single message arrived on a secure account. No signature, just 2 words. You won. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I smiled, not because I felt triumph, but because I finally understood something. In wars between empires and honor, nobody truly wins. We only decide what we are willing to become. If you were in my position, knowing the man you destroyed your father, would you choose revenge, or would you break the cycle? And be honest with yourself before you answer. Did she deliver justice, or did she become exactly what she hated? Drop your verdict in the comments, justice or monster. If you crave stories where power, culture, loyalty, and betrayal collide without mercy, subscribe now, because the next story won't ask for your comfort. It will test your morals.